Well, as you have realized now, I have a funny first name and a funny accent, and that's because I was born and raised in Ireland. The Iowa guys know me well enough by now; they've gotten used to it. But up here, I'm a stranger to most of you, so I'll begin by telling you a little bit about my background to get you used to me. My parents had a farm; it was beef and barley, and I worked summers and through college and in high school in a 500 sow far out to finish operation. This was the early 80s, and back then we were getting 25 pigs per sow per year sold, so it was extremely well managed. And I fell in love with pork production, and they allowed me to bring the gilts home and for free rather than euthanize them and give them my dad's barley, and so that was a profitable business. So I decided to go to college and specialize in it, and just as I was about to graduate, the whole economy in Europe and especially Ireland went down the tubes, and I realized that no matter how hard you work, if the economy is not right, everything else is wrong. So I switched over to economics and studied agricultural economics as a PhD. And then my first job was in Iowa, moved there in '86, and I thought I was done with pigs, but as you know, Iowa is home to the National Pork Board and NPPC, and there are opportunities, if you know about pigs and you know about economics, to do consultancy. And so I've had the opportunity to travel just about every country in the world on behalf of U.S. pork industry to learn about production standards and disease risks, etc. I'll be talking today about exports and where I think they're going to go. That's my primary objective, but also to kind of scare you a little bit about what would happen if we do lose NAFTA and the damage that's already been caused by pulling us out of TPP. Don, should I speak more loudly? Okay, I'll shout. I should say that my wife and I got into farming in Iowa. We grow corn and beans, and we now have a share in a finishing facility. And 2 of our farms are fed with pig manure, so I'm as integrated as some of you are into this business. Okay, I'll talk. You can't talk about exports without knowing if you have product to export, and we're going to have product, that's for sure. And so the next question, and that has to be exported. The real question is at what price. And so I'll talk a little bit about developments in the U.S. domestic market. Then I'll say where the futures are looking, and futures are positive. I'll talk about the reasons that pork producers are expected to make money next year. It has to do with exports and packing plants. I'll talk about exports. I'll give you some data on where we are up to November of 2017. The whole thing is driven by China, as is true in a lot of other commodities, and I'm going to admit that I don't fully understand what's happening in China. I'll give you 2 sides of it and kind of split the middle in terms of whether their production is actually growing or not. And then I'll talk about what's going on in Mexico and Colombia and all of South America, and that's a systematic switch away from expensive beef into less expensive and healthy pork. Those countries had a bad attitude towards pork because of backyard production, and now consumers are learning about healthy pork, and there's a big shift going on to the benefit of the U.S. And then I'll talk about some key markets. And at the end, I'll talk about NAFTA, but also what happened because we pulled out of TPP, and in particular, a free trade agreement between the European Union and Japan, which will eventually erode our biggest market. I think you all know this, but U.S. pork production is definitely growing. It's just one company in Iowa that had about 8% of the sows is now increasing its sow numbers by 50%. So it's like for sure Iowa's going to add 4% more sows in a relatively short period of time. The WASDE report that came out suggested that U.S. pork production in 2018 will be up as much as 5%. And so we've got to get rid of that product. U.S. consumers in a good year will consume 1% more pork. So we're looking for, we really need profitable and open export markets. Weights are also up. This panel on the left are producer weights, and this blue line are weights in 2017, and you can see that numbers are up and weights are up as well. That's happening at a time when we have a lot of other protein. This is beef, pork, lamb, chicken and turkey, and you can see that production of all meats in the U.S. is rising. And that's one of the challenges with getting rid of all that pork on the domestic market, because we're trying to get Americans to eat more chicken and more lamb and more beef too. So there's definitely a challenge. So that's now normally in an economic situation, if you say supply is up, then you'd expect prices to be down, and that's not the case. My colleague Lee Schultz at Iowa State puts together what he calls a crush, which is how much the difference between in this case, the costs of a farrow-to-finish operator in Iowa, and then the return. And if the number's on top of the line, it means those guys are profitable. And he uses the open market hogs, which are typically sell at about $5 less than most people with contracts. And so if this schematic farm is making money, then everybody's making money. And what he does in this blue line is he looks forward using the futures. And he did this 5th of January. The market's been up a little bit since then, so things are better. And you can see that looking forward, the futures market is expecting a profitable year, and that's on top of several profitable years going back to 2014. We've had issues in the fall in a couple of years, but generally the industry has been profitable. The other way he looks at it is he takes the nearby futures, which is the gray line, and then he looks forward and looks at where the futures is for that period in 2018. So it's a similar method. And you can tell that we had that drop in October of 17. October prices are higher. And then I'll share his verbiage with you. This is comparing last year's cash prices, which are basis adjusted off the futures for each quarter, and then comparing the futures price, so it's apples and apples. And he said that the futures price for 18 is 8.3% higher than it was in 17, and then you can do that by quarter. It's only 3.9% higher in quarter 1, 11% in quarter 2, 16 in quarter 3, and 17.4% in quarter 4. So the unusual situation here is we've got a lot of pork, but the futures traders expect markets to be better than they were, and that's going to require a lot of exports, at least how I think about it. Because if you're going to try and sell 5% more pork at a higher price, it better be true that you've got a lot of export demand. At least the futures markets participants think we're going to get a lot of exports. A part of the reason for increase in profitability is that we've added packing space. And I congratulate those producers who had enough foresight to do that, because had we not added packing space, we would have had a crisis in fall of 2017, and certainly in the fall of 2018. But we have packing space, and that means the dynamics have changed away from the people who owned the scarce packing space, which were the packers, to the producers, because now there's a whole lot of revolution going on with people trying to secure supplies for new packing plants, and that's giving producers some market power. And if you'll bear with me here, this is a measure of the packer gross margin, which is the cutout plus byproduct minus the hog price. And the average is that red line, and you can see that in 2016, the margins for packers were pretty high. And then in 2017, they've generally come down. And so that's added, if you compare November to here to there, that's a $30 difference. And that is a measure of the transfer of power from scarce packing plants to now scarce hog supplies, because the packers are trying to line up new supplies. This is the contribution to each primo to change in the value of the cut. And that's a comparison of January 5th, 2018 to January 5th, 2016. The line is pulling the carcass value down. Some of the export products, the butt, the picnic, and the rib, butt and picnic are up, and hams are down too. When I did that last time, it was bacon that was pulling prices, but right now it's the butt and the picnic. And then this is the July futures, just until a couple of days ago. And you can see what happened back in September. The traders thought futures would be at 76, and now they're at 84. So the futures market participants have gotten good news about something that will occur this year, and I'm thinking it's exports. I don't know if I can give you numbers to fully document the full optimism of the futures traders. In fact, if I was in production, I'd be starting to lock in some supplies right now. But I do think there is opportunity in the export business, and that's what I'd like to turn to next. I know this is busy, but it's just for me. I'll read out the key numbers. Year to date, which is January to November, this is pork and pork products. So I'm going to include variety meats and processed product like brats or spam or bacon. And total up to now, year to date, it's up 6.54%. Mexico has been a successful market, up 9% this year. That was on top of a good year before. Japan has been steady. China has been down, but China had surged in a couple of prior years. And if you take China and Hong Kong down here, you'll see that China and Hong Kong, which is really Hong Kong is just a port in China now. Hong Kong has become one of our, China-Hong Kong has become one of our top 3 markets. And then if you look down here, you'll see a lot of positives. Plus 65% for Colombia, plus 24% for the Dominican Republic, plus 59% for Chile, plus 49% for Guatemala, New Zealand 52, Peru 29, Singapore 32, Nicaragua, and you'll notice that there's only a couple of negatives all the way down. So this year, the export business has been pulling up prices. Generally, we know a lot about pork supplies in the U.S., and the U.S. consumer is a predictable customer. And so when you see big changes in prices, you can often attribute it to exports. And I don't know what the December numbers will be yet, but based on what's happened in the futures and how I know how the exports link to cash hog prices, my bet is that exports in December have been particularly good, and we'll find out soon. Now, all of those countries I mentioned with big numbers are countries with whom we have free trade agreements. So if you're against trade, you shouldn't be in the pork business, because free trade agreements, such as with Central America, Colombia, and South Korea, they changed the dynamics. For instance, South Korea wanted to have its own pork industry, and so it set things up so that corn and soybean imports could come in duty-free, and pork imports had heavy duties. As part of the free trade agreement, the asymmetric duties on pork have been eliminated, and now we're seeing essentially a relocation of the South Korean pork industry back to where corn and soybeans are grown, because it's far cheaper to move pork than it is to ship corn and soybeans. Okay, so why are we exporting so much? Well, there's been an elephant in the room, and it's China. And this blue line here are Chinese pork imports by year. You can see that China was a small importer, and then suddenly in about 2007, 2008, it started to pick up. And in 2016, it reached almost 3 million tons. And then it's down a little bit in 2017 year to date. But compared to what it was, you can see that China is just the dominant force in world pork markets. And for comparison, I put in Japan and Mexico. And we all think of Japan and Mexico as being huge markets, but they're tiny compared to what has happened in China. Now, a lot of our product is not eligible to go into China. If it was eligible, China would be far our number one buyer of our product, but it's not. So but it's the number one buyer of Canadian and European product. And by buying their product off the market, it frees up space for our product to go into a lot of countries, such as Singapore, or Japan, or South Korea, where we were competing with them. So we're kind of backfilling, and that's why we're seeing such consistently good numbers for every country. And that's because the Europeans are able to get decent prices in China for some of their products, so they're not selling it at a loss against our best interests in other countries. So that's everything. And if I could just figure out what's going on in China, I could give you definitive answers as to where exports are going to go. But I'm going to talk about why things are so hard to understand in China, and then I'll give you my best guess and let you know that it is just a guess. First of all, this is who's exporting to China. Blue is the EU. They've done phenomenally well. We're okay, but we're not at all like the Europeans. And then these are the countries that have shipped. I left out the U.S. because the U.S. exports to China, as measured by the Chinese. It's very bad data. A lot of plants in Europe that haven't been approved for export, or a lot of plants in Brazil, they use U.S. boxes. And so China claims to be importing twice as much pork from us as we are selling to them because the boxes are being reused. So I left the U.S. off that. And you can see that, let's take this one here first. It's Germany. Germany used to be a pork importer, and now it's a massive pork exporter. Their government put in place payments for anaerobic digesters, which are incredibly profitable. So everybody in Germany became a pig finisher, so they had manure to sell back to the government. That program has since been cancelled, but it really increased pork finishing in Germany. Next we have Spain. Spain is interesting. It's a lot of the production is in the Barcelona region. These are companies that owned processing, like pork processing brands, and they went back into producing their own pork, and they're selling it as branded products in Spain. They're selling the loins into France into a protected market because Europe protects its pork industry, and then they have byproduct they can sell all over the world. And in this case, it would be legs. And then you've got Canada. Notice that this Canada is in yellow here. Canadian exports to China are actually up, despite everybody else being a little bit down. The Canadian pork industry went ractopamine free to take advantage of the China opportunity. The U.S. industry is somewhat racto free, maybe 25–30%, but most of the product is not racto free. So Canada is really shipping a lot into China, and the markets that Canada would have had, we have now. And the whole racto debate it's like the Russia thing on CNN. I don't want to talk about it anymore. But the punchline is the industry has taken on a cost, which is not having access to racto, but their prices are set as our prices minus a basis, and so they're not really getting the full benefit of their access to China. Or, if another way of looking at it is, they're pulling up the whole North American market because they have access into China. Okay, so I'm going to talk about China, just a little bit of production and consumption. This is USDA projection of Chinese consumption. They had some pretty expensive pork, and the government clamped down on a lot of the expensive parties they had. So pork production in China actually fell a little bit, and now it's expected to go up in 2018. So we've got a market that's kind of going back to normal and seeing a gradual increase in consumption. The scale here is shocking. This is 50 million tons. So if you move from 40 to 50, that's about the whole U.S. pork industry right there in a few years of increase in consumption in China. And then this is the USDA projection on Chinese sow numbers. They were at about 50 million sows, at least according to the official statistics, and now those numbers have fallen to about a little bit over 40 million. Now, the producers in China who are located in the right place are making about as much as $100 an animal. So you'd normally expect in this situation that Chinese pork production would skyrocket. But a lot of the pig farms there are located in the wrong places. A lot of them, the local authorities would go to typically a builder, a developer, and say, here's 10 acres, we want you to build a pig farm because we want our little commune to be self-sufficient in pork. And then typically the builder would take a couple of acres and put in 100 sows and use the other 8 acres to build apartments. And they'd locate it on the edge of town so they could use the manure on nearby fields. Well, what's happened is those fields those towns have grown around those farms, and the producer doesn't have a place to put the manure. They don't have a place to put the dead pigs. It's a mess, and they were dumping them into rivers and dumping the manure in. Suddenly the people in China really turned against the pork industry, and the central government gave the local authorities in the south, where a lot of the pigs are, the right to shut down facilities. And we don't know how many facilities are being shut down. And that's the problem. We have fantastic profit in the facilities in the Northwest that are profitable, but they're forcibly closing a lot of the facilities in the South. And there's a zero tolerance policy in some southern provinces. They want to be completely free of pork production. You see these numbers, like Chinese pork statistics, and you say, well, somebody must have gone out and counted. But that's not true. Most numbers that we use are kind of official government statistics, maybe adjusted by the USDA a little bit. The truth is we don't know. I happened to be there this summer, and the boss of the USDA and NAS was there at the U.S. Embassy at the same time. And I learned from him that China has never really had a good sense for its agriculture. But they're doing the first official census right now. And to have 1 million people, enumerators, to go out and talk to the farmers, and they had to buy 1 million iPads, one for each enumerator. So it gives you a sense of the scale of the problem. Because if you think they have 60 million pork producers, nobody really knows. And so because we don't know how big the industry is, you have to be a little bit careful with using the official data. And so there's a couple of schools of thought. One is the U.S. Embassy and Rabobank believe that they're killing these sows and that the sow meat is flooding the market, and that's pushed prices down. There's another school of thought that the industry is growing and that's pushing prices down. And the truth is we don't know. I've come up with a third theory, and that is the local officials who were overestimating sow numbers, they know that they're going to be caught soon because the census numbers are going to come in, so they're truing up the numbers before they're caught. And so we're seeing this enormous decline in this sow herd. It's a mythical thing because for the first time ever, we're going to get an accurate measure. And the old method whereby every village reported up to the commune and the commune to the province, they all tended to overestimate their success in being self-sufficient in pork. And so I think we're going to discover that the Chinese have been dramatically overestimating the size of their pork herd. I've kind of made the point here that China drives everything, but we don't know what's going on. But you can always trust prices. And I'll show you some prices now, and to give you a sense for, so the red line here is our Chinese live hog prices. With China, you have to use the live hog because there's a lot of value in the live hog in China that is not in our pigs, and so you have to do a comparison of live and live. I mean, the head and the feet are worth as much there as the loin and tenderloin, so you've got to make a decent comparison. And then these are Spain, Germany, and the U.S. And this is 2014. We had PED, so we had very high prices. Then a lot of the small backyard operations in China were shut down, and then more recently, the larger operations are being shut down. So there's a scarcity of pigs in China. And in 2016, we saw this surge in exports that I described earlier. And then prices fell, and that's the bit we don't know. We don't know if it's because their production is growing or because they have a lot of sows. And I don't claim to know that either. And then prices have picked up again. Now, if you look at this difference, and this is as of last week, so it's pretty accurate, there's still a big margin between the U.S. price and the Chinese price. Now, the European prices used to track U.S. prices pretty well, but they've pulled ahead because they have better access in China than we do. So they're getting a little bit of a premium because of that drop credit over us. But if you look at this price compared to that, we can export pork profitably into China at that price differential. We can pay the 12% duty. There's a value-added tax of, I think, 13%, and there's transportation. But at this comparison, we can export into China. The other way to look at prices is how much are people paying for feeder pigs. And that's the feeder pig price in China. And you can see that feeder pig prices, quite obviously, increased dramatically in 2016, and they haven't really come down. So I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to give you my guess as to what's going to happen at market. I think the Chinese imports will stay in that 3 million ton range for quite some while. And my Chinese counterparts would agree with me that a lot of it is variety meats. You know, the pig only produces one head, so if you want to have more heads, you have to buy them. A lot of it is inexpensive hams and inexpensive shoulders that the Chinese are buying because it's cheaper to import them than it is to import from us. And also, they've made these trade relationships. They've found out the consistency and quality of imported product, and I think they're going to stick with it. So I think the Chinese pull on the market will be around for several more years, and that gives me room for optimism about U.S. exports and essentially looking at next year and the year after that, possibly as a repeat of this year. Okay, so if China's going to buy, where's it going to come from? Now, I belong to a group called Interpig, which is a pork economist from every pork-producing country, just about out there. And we meet once a year, and we have these big what are they called when you compare prices? Benchmarking. It's a benchmarking exercise. This big, complicated spreadsheet. You got to make all these adjustments. You know, what is a gilt? Is a carcass got the head on or the head off? There's a whole lot of, and when it's all said and done, we publish a report that compares production costs against all these countries. This is important because you would say, well, Europe and Canada have better access in China, so therefore they're going to grow and we're going to fall. But actually, our production costs, as you can see here, are lower than just about anywhere else in the world by a significant amount. And given that, there can be years when the German pork industry is losing money and we're making money, even though we're both getting the same delivered price in some of these Asian markets. And that's the potential that exists. Finland and Sweden and Ireland are very high. There are a lot of social kind of policies. Also, the UK is very expensive. Brazil and Mato Grosso, I was shocked to find it. Every other year we did it, Brazil was cheaper than us, but this year they came in ahead. Canada was always comparable with us, but they changed their method of estimating production costs, and remember that they got rid of ractose, so we're a little bit less expensive, actually quite a lot less expensive than them, maybe $1.03 to $1.22. And so if there is room for import demand, it's possible that something that the Europeans would not be expanding, even though we're expanding. And that's because we can profit at a market price that causes them to be in a loss. And that's what the USDA is projecting for next year, is European pork production, which is over here. Production here as being flat to slightly down. So we're selling into the same markets. They're not getting subsidies on those exports unless you count the fact that their domestic market is protected. So if you're selling a loin into a protected French market, and that cuts the break even on what you have to sell the ham for, because you're getting a high price on the loin. So whether the Europeans are subsidized or not is a whole different story. But they're not expanding. We're seeing expansion in Spain, but we're seeing offsetting reductions in places like Germany and Italy and France. The Canadians are expanding. Their production was flat for years, and now it's started to pick up. Their domestic consumption is flat, and so their exports have been increasing, and they will continue to increase. Brazil is the same thing. Their production has been growing. It was true that their domestic consumption was growing too. Then they had some economic problems. The economy wasn't growing as quickly, and so some of that product was exported. Now, I want to talk a little bit about something that I've noticed over the last 5 years, and that is 15 years ago, if you went to Colombia or Peru or even Mexico and you said pork, people thought of a backyard product. They thought it potentially had trichina. There's another brain-wasting disease, I think it's called cysticercosis, and the people thought that pork had that problem too. And so it shocks me to go into Sam's Club and see Americans buy $10 beef loin when you've got $2 pork loin. Maybe Americans are rich enough to do that, but the people in Central and South America are not. And so what's happening is they're realizing that modern pork production produces a product that doesn't have those two disease issues or pathogen issues, and as such can be viewed as a viable protein or a viable competitor to beef. So this is beef and veal in consumption in Mexico. You can see it's falling slightly. Poultry is up. This is pork. Pork is up at the expense of beef, and then poultry, as is true in just about all over the world, is up too. So the punchline there is that there's a fundamental transformation of the economies to our southern border, of all of them, where they're finally figuring out that pork is a much cheaper and equally delicious substitute for beef. I see Karen Richter's here. I want to tell you a story, a success story. This is something the National Pork Board did. We had access in Colombia, and instead of going in and fighting with their producers, the U.S. pork industry, National Pork Board, went down and funded a generic pork campaign in Colombia to tell the people that pork is safe. And their industry was tiny because they didn't have much of an industry because the production costs were so high and because nobody bought their product. And suddenly, Colombians started to buy pork, and they bought a lot of imports. Remember I showed you their imports are up 50, 60%? And their domestic industry has not really suffered. That's that blue line there. And their pork consumption is skyrocketing. And so that to me was one of the most insightful campaigns to work with an industry rather than against it. And I think when they started, consumption of pork in China was about 2.5 or 3 kilograms. It's more than double that now. And it's going to continue to grow. And it's happening in Peru and in other countries too. And that's that transformation I described. Japan has been, this is just Japanese imports by country. They've been a little bit of a disappointment, in part because Canada has grown and Spain has grown. And some of that was due to the closure of the Russian market. And you can see that in the last couple of years, our exports to Japan have picked up. What had happened a while ago was Russia closed to Europeans, and the European product was available elsewhere. And so it is kind of, even though the trend looks down, you can see the last couple of years we've had modest increases in that market too. And Japan is our #1 value market. South Korea, we, as of this year, only one product has a duty on it. So essentially we now have duty-free access in Korea. This is domestic consumption, this gray line, and you can see it's skyrocketing. It was a fish-based society, and the quantity of seafood is not available anymore, so they're switching back into red meats, and their consumption has grown. Their production is more or less stable, and then their imports are up, and we're doing particularly well in that market. A couple of other markets. This is the Philippines. Big volume increases from Germany, Spain, and the U.S., and that's a huge market looking forward. And then Russia. And I mentioned that Brazilian pork production is growing, but I didn't seem too concerned about it. That's because whatever Brazil wants to export, it can sell it into Russia because it's the only supplier into that market. Because Russia's fallen out with just about every other supplier except Brazil, Chile, Belarus, Serbia, Paraguay, and others. So the increase in Brazilian production will be absorbed by Russia because the Russians are having problems with their own domestic production because of African swine fever outbreak. I just thought I'd throw this in there. As I mentioned, I'm from Ireland, and there's a discussion going on right now about Brexit. And the British agreed to something that is absolutely crazy. They said there would be no border between the north of Ireland, which is the United Kingdom, and the south of Ireland. And yet they're going to have their control over their own flows of labor, and they're going to have their own regulations. Now, how can you control something if you don't have any border? So the British have agreed to something that's impossible. And that means there's a serious danger that Brexit will be hard in the sense that the UK will have to negotiate it, find markets for its products outside of Europe because the Europeans will go to most favored nation duty. And as such, Britain would become open to the US pork industry. And I thought I'd show you that because Britain is one of the biggest pork importers in the world. It's of the same order of magnitude as Japan or Mexico, about 1 million tons a year. And of course, that's all coming from Denmark right now and the Netherlands, but it could potentially come from us if there's a duty on their product. And if anybody can figure out how Brexit's going to work and not have a fight between the Europeans and the British, let me know, because how you say you're going to control the movement of people when you've already promised that there won't be any border posts is kind of ridiculous. So I'm going to finish the first part of my presentation now, and then I'm going to talk about what's going on in D.C. with Trump. So the punchline here, China is driving the market. My guess is that China should continue at about 2017 levels for some time, meaning that our export opportunities will grow. China absorbs a lot of European and Canadian products, which allows us to backfill. I would expect continued 8% growth in exports, which is an additional 2% per year. Now, if the USDA is right and our production is going to go up by 5%, and you've got a 1% increase in U.S. consumer price for pork and 2% for exports, that means those futures traders are even more optimistic than me, or equivalently, this might be a good time to lock in some hedges for looking forward. I don't see the export market taking 4% more, and yet we're on a strategy to do that. And I am one of the most optimistic persons about exports, but I don't see exports being as important as is currently built into those futures prices. Okay, so some downside now. As you know, we pulled out of TPP. Europeans were in a panic about TPP. They didn't want to be left out. And so they were about 6 months behind us in negotiating free trade agreement with Japan and Vietnam. And when we pulled out, they went ahead. And in 2019, they will start reducing their duties on European product. Of particularly important is they're going to rapidly phase out their duties on processed pork. This is where you add salt to ground pork and you call it seasoned ground pork. And that's a huge market for the U.S. And they're going to take the European duties over 5 years down to zero, and we'll have full duties. And so in a commodity business, we're going to lose that market. And then over the next 10 years, they're going to take the gate price down to 10 cents a pound for the Europeans, which is nothing. And so, and this is not a projection. This is actually in law. We're going to be behind in Japan, our #1 market, and in Vietnam relative to the Europeans. Moreover, the TPP-11 are going ahead with a negotiation, and I would bet that that will succeed. And so Canada will have better access in Japan than we will too. And lastly is this NAFTA thing. I want to talk a little bit about this because I want each of you to go home and scream at your local politician. This is about the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I'm normally a very laid-back guy. I keep my head down, but I've gone out on a limb on this one. What we've decided to do, well, first of all, there are some people in the White House who are not trained in economics. They think that trade is a zero-sum game. If we win, somebody else has to lose. Oh, and because it's a zero-sum game, it's like poker, and so we can bluff. And so what we've decided to do is we're going to cancel NAFTA. We'll have 6 months, and that will force the Mexicans and the Canadians to come to our terms because we're going to bully them. We're going to bluff them. Now, the administration has not ordered an economic study of what would happen if we pull out of NAFTA. So they're fully convinced that when we pull out, the Mexicans and Canadians will do exactly what we tell them to do. It's kind of like mutually assured destruction. Well, on one of these trips I mentioned, I had the opportunity to talk to some of the very senior leadership in Mexico, the political leadership, and they are so annoyed at us right now. The stuff about who's doing the raping and who's building the wall. The population down there has given their politicians the right to call our bluff. Now, they're buying 10% of our product. Can you imagine losing a customer that's buying 10%? And what will happen is at the end of the 6 months, they will have lined up pork from Europe and from southern part of Brazil, from any country, and then they'll put 20% duties on our product. And if you have in a commodity business, if U.S. pork has a 20% duty, we're doomed. We can't. We grew our industry by 10% because we were competitive in Mexico. Now we're going to have a 20% duty on us, and it's just awful. And so the punchline here is if NAFTA blows up, all bets are off. So I had an opportunity to engage in this debate. One of my friend's students, who is Joni Ernst, ag person, called me up and said, well, Joni's meeting with President Trump. We need to tell him about this problem. So I put together a few slides. This was presented to President Trump and apparently has helped get him to not do that for temporarily, right? Nobody knows what's going to happen next week. But what I said was we're selling 10% of our pork to Mexico. They would have 20% duties. U.S. future traders are aware of that. And about 3 times this year, a rumor has gone through the futures market that we're going to lose the Mexican market. And on those days when it happened, and I was able to document them, the price of a live hog would fall as much as 6 cents, just based on a rumor. And if you do 6 cents times 10 million a month, that's 60 million per month, or over a year, that's 722 million. And I believe actually that just the mere presence of a risk that we could pull out in NAFTA is keeping a damper on live hog prices. Things could be even better had we not had this scare. And so these were some of the charts I put in. This was January 26th. I happened to be with some pork producers, and we were watching the market, and it fell like a rocket that day, and it did recover because the rumor was found flawed. And so what Senator Ernst did was show this to Trump and say, don't do this. Now, these are the people who voted for you, and apparently he held off for a while. But my guess is we'll need to take the media's attention off something else, and we'll be back to pulling out of NAFTA or pulling out of Korea. And so if you have any political persuasion at all, please tell your local representatives up here, as the guys in Iowa have already done, that we need to keep in NAFTA because we grew an industry by 10%. We're growing it even more. We're depending on that market. It's a fantastic market, and we could potentially lose it. And I'll stop there and say thank you. Todd, did I say anything you disagree with?
I do have a question for you. What was the key, when grain was part of it, what was the key that flipped Brazil's cost of production higher than the U.S.?
Yeah, I think when their currency fell by, what, 40, 50%, the price of their feed, their number one, feed is even more important down there than it is here, and that went up, and that must have been enough to flip that around. I talked to the guy who did it, who works for the Brazilian government, and he was as surprised as me. But it must have been a reduction in the value of their currency, causing an increase in the cost of their feed and other imports, which more than offset the reduction in the cost of their labor. Yeah.
With the possibility of a government shutdown, I believe last time we had a government shutdown, didn't that, we lost our meat, especially with that. How would that affect exports?
We lost access to the data, which essentially caused the futures market to go into turmoil because they weren't reporting the data. That was some tension between a Secretary of Agriculture who didn't particularly like the pork industry and who wanted to cause as much disruption as possible, versus the Secretary of Agriculture now who's tuned in. So I suspect if there is a shutdown, that those staff will be viewed as very important, and they won't be asked to quit. Yeah.
With the EU's higher cost of production in exports into China, how long is that sustainable? Is that sustainable?
So even though they've benefited from China, they're not growing, and in that sense, the party's over. But in Japan, the seasoned ground pork I talked about, that's something that they have in surplus. It's not a big product for their consumers, and so they could, if they had a 20% cost duty advantage over us, they could take over that market. And that's, in some years, that's been $1 billion export. So. And the other thing I'll say about trade is we used to have free trade agreements stacked up like planes coming into Chicago, and now there's nothing going on. In fact, the other countries are doing it, and we're not. And so we're falling further and further behind, and we've got this machine that's growing to produce more pork because we have these export opportunities, and that's all coming to an end at about 2020. And Americans will not eat, 30% more pork? Gene?
I didn't see a trend on domestic consumption in China.
There was one there, and it's trending back up. I had the USDA embassy projection, and it's about an extra 1 million tons this year. They had fallen for about 3 years because pork was expensive and because the government shut down all those parties, but it's back on the uptick now. Question?
China sucking up all the production from Canada and the EU. How much of an opportunity does that give us to go into a country like India, which will soon be bigger than China?
I was able to go to India with funding from the pork industry, and of course there are some Muslims there, and they tend to handle a lot of the meat, and they won't touch pork. But the Hindu, I discovered, are not actually against pork. And I went out with Hindu people, and they were eating pizza and bacon. They're just against meat, but nothing specifically against pork. So there's a very modest opportunity. There's probably 50,000 tons a month opportunity in hotels because you can't get decent bacon or decent sausages if you want to kind of an English breakfast. But longer term, there's a modest opportunity. And we heard of some of the Chinese restaurants there are sending people out with suitcases to bring suitcases full of pork in. And the Dutch apparently now have access into that market, and we're very, very close. So it's modest because generally they're a chicken-eating country rather than a pork-eating country, which is China. But it's there. It's worth looking at. Question?
Even if the Mexicans would put a 20% tariff on our pork, would we still be cheaper than the Europeans?
Well, we would be if the EU had to pay a duty, but no, I don't think the shipping cost from the EU, it's about 9 cents a pound. it wouldn't compete with a 20% duty. And, of course, the Mexican pork industry would have a 20% advantage over us, and they're already growing. And the Canadian pork industry would have a 20% advantage over us. And so, in the long run, we would need to downsize the U.S. pork industry. At the same time, we're downsizing the beef industry and the chicken industry and the egg industry. And at the same time, we have a glut of corn and soybeans. And so some of those rural counties would be really hit. Question?
I didn't hear you mention about the dollar. Exports, you say,
Yeah, in the short run, if you have pork that you've already produced and the dollar gets weak, you can sell it a lot easier. But over the long haul, if the dollar is weak, then the cost of feed in the U.S. has gone up. And that's what Todd and I were just talking about with Brazil. Their currency went down, and yet the production costs went up because they got to pay world prices for feed grains. So what it really matters is the portion of production that's tradable, like grain and money, versus non-tradable, like buildings. But short run, definitely you're right, and the dollar has gotten weak recently, and I'm sure that's part of why our futures prices are up. But long term, it doesn't really have that big an effect on relative production costs. It gives the Canadians advantage in two ways. First, there's the short run effect. I mean, but all their pork is discounted off the U.S. market. But also, they're specializing in sows. And with sows, labor is very important in buildings, and they're non-tradable. And so the actual value, measured in U.S. dollars, the cost of Canadian labor is going down as their currency has fallen. And that's giving them an advantage in sow production. Done? No, and the best pork producers are the Dutch and the Danes, and their government have effectively shut down finishing in both countries. Germany discovered that it was subsidizing finishing, and it shut down the source of the subsidy. So if you drew a line across Europe to the north of that, the governments really don't want the pork finishing. They're happy with sows because of the labor issue. And then you're looking at that area around Barcelona where they really need employment. I mean, Spain really hurt in the Great Recession. They have very low wages. Even though that industry is importing its feed with low wages in pig farms and with packing plants and a government that's pro-pork industry, they're actually growing. Question?
People in Barcelona looking to separate pork production.
I don't know. I suspect not. But if it got worse and Barcelona somehow pulled out of Spain, then it would also pull out of the European Union. And then it would be like a Brexit situation. And then they wouldn't be able to sell all those loins into France at a protected price. So, yeah, if they pulled out, it would be. But I haven't seen it. In my contacts there, they don't seem as concerned at all. Well, thank you for your attention.